How serious is this threat of this anti-coercion instrument?
Well, obviously, the European leaders are extremely frustrated with the president. They just view this as a bridge too far. And so they really are putting all options on the table. Of course, we have gone through low points between the United States and the EU before in and around Ukraine. So there certainly are off ramps here. That was, I think, Secretary Bessent's message was for everybody to take a deep breath. But look, this is not round one. Frustrations have been building. So I think there is certainly a possibility, although not in my base case right now.
All right. Ben, I want to come over to you. One of the things we've been citing all morning long is the sharp rise when it comes to bond yields and also metals. Do you see this as bond investors reacting specifically to Greenland, or is it just generally some of the other tensions we've seen, not only globally, but even here domestically, with the president calling for some measures domestically that seem to be riling investors?
I think there's a few things happening, Frank, because, as you mentioned, like there's the president's measures. And, if you want to acquire Greenland, there's a price tag. And, there's estimates of 200 to 700 billion. So somehow that has to be paid for, likely first with issuing more bonds. It's one way to think about this bond yield move. Then we also have to look at what's going on in Japan, where there's a snap election now for lower house, and Japanese yields are up about 25 basis points. So it does get an impact on U.S. Treasury yields as well. And lastly, the tariffs, as you outlined in the segment, the different things going on here, right? We have these stepwise tariffs, which are kind of new from the IEEPA tariffs we normally use. And then we get these separate tariffs on champagne and things like that. So you get the winners and losers. And I think you get this illiquidity in the markets, and that's reflected, I think, too, in bond yields. So we're going to get a little bit of pressure here, I think, on the bond market and until this settles out.
All right. Sarah, coming back over to you, a couple issues very closely tied not only to Europe but to France. The issue of the Council of Peace. The president wants Emmanuel Macron to join that. Also, those tariffs on French wine and champagne. When we're looking at these issues, specifically when it comes to tariffs, our Jim Cramer pointed out that it may have been easier for the president to make these threats once he had the Supreme Court decision. How does that factor in it? The fact that we're going to get a decision from the Supreme Court on tariffs, does that change the negotiating power the president has with European nations specifically related to tariffs?
Well, certainly all eyes are on the Supreme Court, and they could rule as soon as today. And we still think it's likely that they will at least in part rule against the president. But I do think that some who are upset about this latest geopolitical flare-up are a little bit too confident that even that a strike down of IEEPA would really change the president's negotiating tactics. There are other tariff avenues. They do require more process, more investigations than IEEPA, so it's a little bit hard to say 10% one day, 25 the other. But IEEPA gives the president a lot of authority, and there's a lot of other tariff authorities. So I'm not positive that even if the Supreme Court rules here, Donald Trump will be changing his negotiating tactics. And he seems to have a knack for really getting under people's skin. I'm not sure that's going to really change.
All right. What about the military threat? How seriously do our European allies take that when it comes to Greenland?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we've seen this a lot with President Trump, where he comes in really very, very strong. And I get it. This one is particularly disruptive. This violates a lot of sensibilities around NATO and principles, and I think does get to the core of a lot of concerns among policymakers. But I do think if past this prologue, he's really using this to really seek some other agenda. It's a little bit unclear this time exactly what it is, and so I understand why the markets are nervous, because they have kind of, since Liberation Day, kind of been trusting that these things are going to ratchet down, and there's not a real clear path here. But ultimately, what I think this president is going to seek is something more like NATO cooperation, more investment, more defense spending. My guess is that he's not going to take it to its logical conclusion. But as is always the risk with this president, things can spiral out of control, and I think that's what's causing the anxiety.
All right, Ben, coming over to you. How serious do you see the military threat? What do you see the economic impact as? You came out with a note called Boots on the Ice. So it seems like you think that threat may be considerably real. You also highlight that the EU is considering 93 billion in euros of tariffs against the U.S. and also that ACI, often called the nuclear option.
I think all those measures are real, Frank, and it's part of the negotiation that's sort of starting. Also to note, though, that the head of NATO Mark Rutte, he's quite friendly with Trump. He's already reached out to him, and he's already signaling on Twitter that we're going to be working this out. So that gave me a bit of a signal of sort of like, okay, there will be some kind of appeasement here. But to your point about military action, the U.S. has 150 troops on the ground, on the ice, as they wrote, in Greenland. So it could expand that, obviously. It could put a more military presence there. Denmark has said that they want NATO surveillance in Greenland. And so you have this tension too. And I think the base metals are reacting, for example, to that idea that, you get more defense spending and this tension. Let's see these parabolic moves that then get reflected back into equity markets and bond markets, because it's not very liquid at the moment. So I think this is what's playing out, frankly. There's a bit of a threat of military action, but I don't think you can see like an invasion or something like that.
All right. So if you don't see the threat of invasion, when we're talking about the markets, what do you see the biggest impact if the president continues this campaign? I'm talking to you, Ben. If the president continues this campaign to try to get control of Greenland, what's the market impact? We're seeing the sell-off today, but we've seen moves like this before where the markets sell off initially and then actually in the pre-market and then actually go in throughout the day and they actually close higher. I'm thinking back to Venezuela as being a great example. We saw some pressure on the futures in the pre-market and then record close for the S&P later that day.
And I think that's how it's setting up, Frank. You see pressure on tech, and that has to do with those tariffs, particularly the coercion tool from Europe that can really target digital services. And I think this is why tech is under pressure currently. But it's just a threat, as you mentioned. Like, it's just posturing here, right? So we're very used to this sort of price action where people take a step back and liquidate positions, and you get this drawdown. And as the day goes on and more news comes out on that they're meeting and that they're having conversations and so forth, people get more calmer and feel like, hey, this is an opportunity to re-engage. As you said earlier, there's tech earnings coming out today and next week. People are going to refocus on that again, seeing like there's an opportunity here. So I think this is the psychology playing out here as we speak.
All right. Sarah, I want to give you the last word. I think one of the under the radar things about all this is how this could potentially impact the trade discussions with China and relations with China. China trying to position itself as a safer alternative to the U.S. How does it impact the U.S.-China relations and also the EU-China relations?
Well, I think that is actually a great question and something that people should be extremely concerned about. The arrangement and sort of tentative agreement we saw between Canada and China around electric vehicles last week was solely unprecedented. It certainly is going to make any conversations about USMCA in this country way more difficult. So I think China has been playing its cards quite well throughout this process. Of course, they're not an unknown quantity. They come with their own challenges, but there isn't any question that the president's approach since he was inaugurated a year ago have certainly led a lot of countries to consider other trade routes in a way that over time could be quite impactful and not positive for the United States.